Whoops, did the wrong slide. Let me do the right one. 1 second. Um, do
And mute yourself.
Yep. Katie, I'm not sure if it's because I'm no longer host, but I can't actually enable the practice session to end. Could you do that?
I'll do it.
Okay. And if somebody can make me host again, that would be great. Thank you.
All yours.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Marion Dry, Chair of Class Act HR 73, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this Class Act Forum, The Future of Vaccines and Vaccine Acceptance. Class Act forums bring experts together to share their knowledge and perspectives about the issues we face right now. Class Act HR 73, Class Achieving Change Together, is a nonprofit organization developed in 2013 to provide members of the Harvard-Radcliffe class of 1973 and others with opportunities to work together to create positive change in the areas of justice and civic engagement, education, health, and the environment. With the aid of the Harvard Alumni Association, we have shared our model with many other classes, and a great number of classes have engaged in the Class Act movement, and it's steadily growing, and we are proud to partner with them. To learn more about Class Act HR 73's work, how you might join us, and to see videos of our forums, please go to our website, classacthr73.org. Please note, we are a nonpartisan organization. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this forum belong solely to the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of Class Act HR 73. Before we begin, this is a Zoom webinar. That means that if you have a question for the panelists, and I'm sure you will have many, you may type it in the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Please don't put it in the chat. As we're going along, however, please watch the chat for links to articles, videos, and websites and practical advice for the webinar. As an attendee, we hope that you will post things in the chat, your comments and your thoughts, and other pertinent URLs to things that might be of interest to the group. Both the videos of this event and resources posted by all in the chat will be made available on our website within a week, and we will notify you when they are up. We do encourage you to share them widely. This is going to be a great deal of important information. Finally, at the end of this forum, we will be hosting a Zoom salon during which all can join in conversation about this topic. And the link to that was in your invitation and will be posted in the chat toward the end of the forum. Today marks the day 5 years ago when the US shut down for COVID-19. Class Act took immediate action by inviting our classmate, Dr. Jonathan Quick, to present our first Zoom forum in later that March. He's back tonight as our moderator, and we are so grateful that he is here. I'd like to tell you a bit about this extraordinary man. Dr. Jonathan Jono Quick is a family physician and internationally recognized global health leader and the author of The End of Epidemics, the looming threat to humanity and how to stop it. Launched in January 2018, his book foreshadowed the arrival 2 years later of COVID-19 and offered evidence-based ways to prevent such pandemics, including breakthrough innovations in vaccine development and trustworthy communications in immunization programs. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Quick served as a managing director for the Rockefeller Foundation's global and US response, which included close collaboration with federal, state, and local governments, as well as civil society organizations and the private sector. Dr. Quick served as director at the World Health Organization from the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, and during which time the organization helped to lead responses to the AIDS epidemic and to SARS, the first coronavirus to go global. Dr. Quick has also served as the president and CEO of global health nonprofit Management Sciences for Health. Dr. Quick's writing has appeared in Time, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Forbes, The Guardian, and elsewhere. And during the pandemic, he was interviewed regularly by North American, European, and Asian media. Dr. Quick is currently an adjunct professor of global health at the Duke Global Health Institute and an affiliated faculty member at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. His current work focuses on market-driven epidemics, from tobacco to ultra-processed foods, firearms, commercial milk formula, and social media. Jono, with that, I hand it over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for the kind words, Marion. And thanks to Class Act, Bart Sachs, for coming up with this idea. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to those of you elsewhere. Um, as Marion mentioned, this is the fifth anniversary of when, or the fifth anniversary of when the World Health Organization confirmed that something we already knew by then, which was that we had a novel coronavirus that spawned a pandemic. It wasn't the first coronavirus to go global, but by far, in a way, the most deadly and the most consequential. The direct lives lost claimed by the pandemic, as we've read now and know now, is more than 7 million. But when the pandemic associated deaths from disrupted healthcare, economic upheaval, and social impact are considered, it's more than 15 million lives. Cost the global economy $16 trillion. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of shutting the entire US economy for 6 months. Nothing bought, nothing sold. It shuttered countless business, putting millions of people out of work worldwide. It prevented more than 1 billion kids from going to school, caused millions of people to fall into poverty, and in this country alone, left several million people with long COVID. When the world faced an entirely new virus for which we had no tests, no proven treatments, and no vaccines, it was a real scramble to respond. But it catalyzed a paradigm shift in office and home diagnostics. It led to several really good therapeutics and the development of a whole new generation of life-saving vaccines. Unfortunately, the challenges of fighting COVID-19 also accelerated a decades-old trend toward vaccine hesitance and consequent decline in vaccination rates among both children and adults. But good news, according to a recent Pew Research Center survey, the majority of Americans still believe that vaccines are critical for the health of their children. And by a lesser majority are still favor vaccines and believe that they are safe and effective for their own use. This topic is particularly consequential at this point in time, given the current measles outbreak, levels of vaccine hesitancy, and potential change and ongoing changes here. So the goal in the US, and as a consequent worldwide, the goals for this evening are to review the past, present, and future impact of vaccines, consider approaches for developing even more effective, quicker to market vaccines so that we have them available when we need them, and especially to explore and encourage vaccine trust and acceptance, looking at ways of there are lots of genuine and heartfelt concerns about vaccines, and the question is, how do we process those and how do we get to the science? So the plan for the evening is a round of questions for our panelists, a discussion of calls to action, and then some Q&A. We'll bring your questions in near the end of the 90 minutes, in the latter part of the 90 minutes. We're really fortunate to have and I'm excited to have such a group of panelists with us. Each really committed and highly accomplished in their own areas. I'll give a brief introduction, but you can find more in the information online for this. Mike Osterholm is director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy and chair in public health at the University of Minnesota. He's a widely respected epidemiologist whose Osterholm Update podcast was essential listening during the pandemic and remains the mainstay of infectious disease information for many of us. He's a member of the among many other things, National Academies of Medicine and Council of Foreign Relations. One of many things admirable about Mike is you never left wondering what he's thinking about an issue. So we look forward to hearing from him. Joe Martin is a fellow classmate from the Harvard class of 73. He spent more than 3 decades with Pfizer companies, including Pfizer Bioprocess, R&D, Pharmaceutical Sciences, Pfizer Global Research and Development. His group's manufacturing processes have been implemented in biomanufacturing facilities in the US, Ireland, and Germany. He received his PhD from Duke, which is where I have the honor and pleasure of teaching now, and worked where he worked with NIH and the National Science Academy, National Science Foundation grants. Professor Marielena Bottazzi is a distinguished scientist and leading figure in the fields of vaccinology and neglected tropical diseases. You'll hear more about that term. She has a career spanning over 2 decades and has made remarkable contributions to global health through her research, leadership, and advocacy. She's professor of molecular pediatrics and molecular virology at Baylor College of Medicine and co-director of the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development. And Dr. Heather Lanhorn focuses on accelerating efficient and equitable access to proven interventions. She's worked a lot in low and middle income countries and is now actively engaged through a multi-million-dollar project in working to improve trusted health communication in the U.S. She got her PhD, her doctorate in science from Harvard School of Public Health, and brings more than 15 years of experience in behavioral science and implementation research, and is currently Assistant Director of Research and Policies at the Duke Global Health Innovation Center, one of the other institutes in the Duke Global Health Institute. So Mike, over your turning first to Mike Osterholm, Mike, over your 5-year career as an infectious disease detective, you've been involved with hundreds of disease outbreaks in the U.S. and worldwide, anywhere from small animals in Minnesota to the global pandemic. You've worked closely with, okay, sorry, I just got distracted by the chat. You've worked closely with local, state, and federal and international health officials to prevent, prepare, and respond to outbreaks. You published some landmark papers on vaccines, and you're relentless about grounding public health decisions on scientific information. So from your perspective, what have been the most significant contributions of vaccination programs over the last 50 years? What are the consequences for children, adults, communities when significant segments of the population remain unvaccinated? And what would be the impact of reduced support and investments for preventing and combating outbreaks of known and yet unknown infectious diseases? So Mike, over to you.
Now I'm in. Thank you very much. If I could get the first slide, please. Let's just start with where we know that the really significant impact has been. And while we recognize that vaccines for children over the course of the last 60 to 70 years has actually been very important, let's just take a recent snapshot look. This is a study recently reported in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. And you can see, just looking at the health and economic benefits of routine childhood immunizations in the era of vaccines for children in the United States, a high-income country, from 1994 to 2023. And among children born during those cohort years, routine childhood vaccinations will likely have prevented nearly 508 million cases of illness, 32 million hospitalizations, 1,129,000 deaths, resulting in a direct savings between 540 billion, societal savings of almost 2.7 trillion. Now, this is a country with high income, where, again, we have the kind of healthcare services that surely could reduce the likelihood of serious illness and death. For the world's impact, there is nothing that is more impactful in terms of looking at years of life lost, potential life lost, than childhood immunizations. And so again, we can't ever forget this. And one of the challenges we have today is we do forget it. Next slide, please. And then things like this happen when we do. We now have the measles outbreak, as many of you are aware of, that's occurring in Gaines County, Texas, spilling over into New Mexico. As of this afternoon, there have been 223 cases reported, 29 hospitalized, includes 2 deaths. And of those cases, only 2% were fully vaccinated, which fits in with that 97% estimate that we think of in terms of protection. And 4% were partially vaccinated, only 1 dose. There was an additional 30 cases in New Mexico. This is an important issue because this all started in a pocket of unvaccinated children in a Mennonite community, but now has spilled over into the general community of unvaccinated individuals. And today we are confronted with a very different mindset among many of our young parents about the need, the benefit, or the risk of vaccines. And this continues to be a real challenge for us. I don't care how good a vaccine is. I don't care if it's Nobel Prize laureate science. If you can't get people to take the vaccine, it's not an effective vaccine. And so we really have to deal with this issue. Next slide, please. And of course, we're confronted with an unprecedented event. I've been in public health for 50 years. I've served at State Health Department for 25 years, as well as being for all 50 years here at the University of Minnesota. Never in my career have I seen the kind of conditions that we're experiencing now, where we have so much mis and disinformation. This was an article that Zeke Emanuel and I published as an op-ed in the New York Times shortly after the election. And we talked about how Secretary Kennedy, now Secretary Kennedy at the time up for nomination and approval, could take it harder for you and your family to get vaccinated. Well, let me just tell you what's happening. While there may be promises made by him to Senator Cassidy that he would not do in the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, that group at CDC that is made up of outside experts of the agency who then advise CDC on what vaccines to approve, recommend, how they recommend them. We have seen many other issues happen where we're concerned. Mr. Kennedy has weighed in on the Texas situation. While he said, parents should consider vaccines by talking to their physician, not at all stressing their importance, but rather stressing the importance of things like cod liver oil, a certain kind of antibiotic, or a steroid. Dangerous, simply dangerous. And just yesterday, we saw the U.S. government now basically pull back all of the grants that have been funded and contracts for U.S. government agencies that were examining the reasons for vaccines hesitancy. And they no longer can fund vaccine hesitancy contracts or grants inside the U.S. government. I could just go on and on here. We are in a collision course with destiny here in our country, and this is a real challenge. Next slide, please. And I just want to leave us in the short time I have here to leave you with, this is a book that I have coming out later this summer, the big one. Mark Olshaker and I co-authored this. And really, it's all about looking at what we experienced with COVID. Our group at Minnesota really was on the forefront with COVID and in predicting its future. It was of note that, in fact, we published our first piece on January 20th saying that this was already the pandemic. This is January 20th of 2020, and get on with it. We get going with it. And yet it still took almost 2 more months. Ironically, it was 5 years ago today that I'd predicted that we would likely see upwards of 800,000 deaths in the next 18 months. And unfortunately, 18 months later, we hit 800,000 deaths in this country. The reason I tell you this is not because we are so smart. There was a certain amount of fortune that allowed that to happen. But I think we're in a position to tell you we're not ready for the next one. I think public health is in less good of a condition in the sense we've lost much of the trust of the public. We are having major challenges getting vaccine research and development funded. And I could go on with a list of issues of what we should be doing to look at vaccines. The mRNA technology was a lifesaver. It clearly was an important vaccine, but it's a good vaccine. It's not a great vaccine. It does not provide durable immunity. It does not necessarily allow us to deal with the variety of different variants that may show up. And we're in the same boat with influenza vaccines. So we have to understand that. And let me just leave you with one last piece. And when we think about having a vaccine available, we've already talked about the need for people willing to take it, but can they get it? Today in this world, we have the capacity to make about 4 billion doses, 4 billion doses of influenza vaccine in 1 year. This is not including mRNA technology, but the standard treatment. These are 2-dose vaccines. That means 2 billion people could be vaccinated in the first year of a pandemic. Now, it seems to me math-wise, that doesn't add up with the fact that we have almost 8 billion people on the face of the earth. So it's not just research and development, it's not just consumer acceptance, it's also what is our ability to manufacture vaccines in a surge capacity moment, which we have here. So we have lots of challenges, but the bottom line is every one of these challenges is worth it. Why? Because these vaccines are lifesavers. They are so, so important. And what we can't do right now is give up and give in. I don't care how difficult things get with this administration. I don't care what is said out of Health and Human Services or CDC or wherever. Now is our time as a public health community to rise and say, we must defend the most powerful tool that we have to impact on the public health of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for that encouragement not to give up or give in. And also thanks for modeling the kind of communication. The current vaccines are good, but they're not great. So being really honest with the public. And unfortunately, we're no less likely to have another COVID or some other thing today than we were before. And we're probably, as you say, less prepared to handle it. So lots out there to think about. Well, and you teed up perfectly, Joe Martin. Joe, given your decades of work in vaccine development and manufacturing processes, what are the prospects for developing future vaccines? How can they apply to COVID, other pandemics, flu, seasonal flu? And what are the challenges for scaling up, carrying on from Mike's point?
So, as difficult as this environment seems to be around the topic of the vaccines, I'm very optimistic myself. And of course, I'm a big proponent of mRNA vaccines, having helped to bring them to the public in the first place. Let me say, if we want a baseline, we should ask ourselves, how many viral vaccines did we actually bring to the marketplace and get approved by the FDA over the last 70 years? We got 23. Okay, now, the other day I went to the roster of clinical trials for just 4 big biopharma companies, and I counted 37 ongoing clinical trials for vaccines. 17 of them were for viral vaccines. A large number of them were for cancer vaccines. Another subset were for vaccines for rare diseases. And believe it or not, they were all mRNA vaccines. So when you look at the level of activity right now that was sparked by the pandemic, and when you look at the accompanying level of vaccine research that was also sparked by the pandemic, it's really a reason for optimism, I think. Now, if I go to the first slide. Okay, let me give you a sense of how it is. We hope to manage future pandemics on the basis of what it is we're doing right now with vaccines. What this slide represents, if you start on the left here with MERS, and then you look down to the bottom, this is a set of putative pandemic viruses that in 2018 was predicted to be problematic by the Global Alliance for Vaccines. And they update this top 10 every year. Now, if you look to the far right, okay, what we're talking about there is clinical trials to manage the development of new products to treat those, at that time, regional diseases. And in 2018, that column was essentially empty. There was only one vaccine under development to treat Ebola. And thank God that was successfully developed by Merck and was very effective when used to contain a large outbreak. Today, when you take a look at what we're doing relative to that set of regional and serious diseases, you can see that every single one of them either has an ongoing clinical trial or preclinical work being done in non-human primates or mice to establish that prior knowledge necessary to advance a vaccine to clinical trials. So clearly, in some sense, we've gotten the message that, we better study regional diseases that later will become pandemics. On the other hand, the other message in this slide is that, gee whiz, in 2018, COVID-19 was not on that list. So, my God, the other thing that this slide tells us is that we have to be agile. We have to be prepared to essentially tackle something brand new and try to bring it to the marketplace in record time, because if we don't, lives are lost. All right. So what is the rest of the slide telling us? Well, it's saying, look, if we don't actually know what the next thing is, let's strategize on what it might be on the basis of what we see in front of us. So what we see are a set of regional diseases. They're all viral in nature, all right? And they all work in a very similar way. They all have the same Achilles heel. They invade the cells in your body by virtue of having something I would call a glycoprotein hook, which will recognize a receptor on the surface of your cells and thereby gain admission to the interior of your cells and launch an infection. So, interestingly enough, all of these vaccines can be, or all of these diseases can be tackled in a similar way. And that's simply to present that glycoprotein hook to the immune system in the form of a vaccine, develop antibodies and other immune mechanisms that will neutralize that hook and thereby prevent or at least abrogate an ongoing infection. Okay, if I could have the next slide, please. Now, I want to welcome you. Mike talked about the inability really to manufacture enough vaccine to inoculate the world, and he's really right. We've lived in the shadow of the influenza pandemic now for 80 years, the greatest pandemic in the history of humankind. And the World Health Organization has tried to mobilize forces over all of that period of time to figure out how to make enough vaccine to stop what they thought would be the next pandemic. And naturally, they thought it would be an influenza pandemic. And we've built up a tremendous amount of manufacturing capacity for influenza vaccines. But the fact remains that that technology is very old. It's based on chicken eggs, and that's why I call it the chicken approach. And the bottom line is, in the 6 months when we have to get ready, essentially, to launch a seasonal vaccine, we use up a tremendous amount of the world's manufacturing capacity. We manufacture approximately 1.5 billion doses of a trivalent vaccine. That would be equivalent to 4.5 billion doses of a monovalent vaccine. Were we to have a sudden pandemic of influenza and we would rely on the chickens, well, what would happen is we would say, stop your seasonal vaccine production, or at least abrogate it to some degree, and give us some room to make pandemic vaccine. And if we were lucky, we might get 4 billion monovalent doses. Now, hey, in a pandemic, it takes 2 doses to provide sufficient resistance to a person, and that would mean that a large part of the world would go short. So, we're all worried about the bird flu right now. We read the Washington Post and the New York Times, and we have to ask ourselves, could we rely on the chickens to save us? And the answer is obviously not with that limited production capacity. Despite the fact that in 18 countries, they have 40 factories, we have inadequate capacity. So what, in fact, would we do were we to have a bird flu pandemic where we had to manufacture a lot of vaccine? Well, clearly, we'd have to go to another kind of manufacturing system to enable it. And what systems would we probably rely on? Well, if we were in China, we would probably rely on what I call the green monkey system. Okay, this is a cell culture system that's based on Vero cells, and they come from the African green monkey kidney. And what is well known in virology is that almost any virus can be cultivated on Vero cells. Now, influenza, not so well, but well enough. Okay, that's already been established by prior vaccine research. And if that is done, at least as well as it was done for COVID, the Chinese will probably be able to manufacture on the order of about 3 billion doses of vaccine a year by that methodology. They'll do so by adding an adjuvant to their vaccine called an aluminum salt, and that's the oldest adjuvant in the business. It worked very well for COVID. So maybe we could count on the Chinese for 3 billion doses, but now we're still short many doses, right? In fact, essentially vaccinate the world, you need 16 billion doses. So what we learned from COVID also is that we could rely on a technology I call the rubber duck technology. Why? Well, because it's lifelike, but in actual fact, it's a completely inanimate technology. It does not rely on living cells for production in any way, shape, or form. It relies on a reaction vessel. And as a consequence, it can be a very fast manufactured vaccine. It can also be a vaccine that is very fast to approval by stringent regulatory authorities. If I could just ask you to go to the next slide. Okay, now this looks like a very technical slide, but in a nutshell, I'm going to, in layman's terms, describe what an mRNA vaccine is. If you look at the top illustration in the slide, you'll see something that has a thing called a cap. It's got a blue section in the middle. This would be a gene expressing the glycoprotein hook for our influenza vaccine. That would be a hemagglutinin molecule. It's got a couple of funny looking things on either end. These are called untranslated regulatory regions. They're made out of RNA, and essentially they allow the translation apparatus to hook up to this entity and translate a message, that message being the protein coding for the hemagglutinin. We managed to put this into our target cells in the form of a vaccine by wrapping it up in a lipid particle that's only got 4 constituents. It's a pretty simple design, but it works very well. Now, the one thing this vaccine has going for it that you really can't see in the picture is that it has 4 letters that make up its code. Okay, these are called the nucleotide bases, and one of them, the uridine base, is disguised. It's actually a molecule called pseudouridine. The 2023 Nobel Prize was awarded to the folks who learned that disguising one of the bases would essentially render that signal in disguise from the internal antiviral systems that your cells have. So this message, as long as it's in disguise, is able to translate hemagglutinin, glycoprotein hook, essentially move that to the cell surface, and present it to the immune system. That's the nature of the vaccine. And
So,
as Mike said,
I hate to break in, but we're getting a little short on time. Can you kind of bring this part?
yeah,
to a close?
okay. So
Thank you.
very
Thank you. Go
quickly,
ahead.
rubber duck is good, but it's not quite good enough. And so now what's come onto the stage, it's just been approved for use with COVID, is something called rubber duck 2. All right. And that's what we see here at the bottom of the screen. Rather than putting the glycoprotein hook into a simple piece of RNA, we now put it into an entire virus replicon. And what viruses have going for them are 50,000 years of viral evolution that have helped them evade the immune system, okay, including the intracellular antiviral system, as well as multiplying themselves to propagate infection. So the main thing we rely on this entity for is this self-amplification phenomenon. And it works very well relative to the rubber duck number 1 concept. But it also is a champion at fighting the immune system antiviral properties. And as a consequence,
that sounds great. So it sounds like what you're saying is it actually, we do have a next generation coming, the potential for that, which maybe which gets beyond some of the constraints that the current that we have right now. And it's good to have a sense of what the potential and what the challenges are in capacity, but also new technologies that will help us going into the future. So we move on to Mary Elena. You've worked in vaccine development for neglected diseases in underserved populations worldwide for quite a while now, and you've been really recognized for your pivotal role in the co-development of an open science, patent-free vaccine technology. So, Marilena, what are neglected and emerging diseases? Where are they? And why are vaccines for them so important?
Absolutely. Well, first, thanks so much to the invitation. And Jono, I am one of your biggest fans, and the panelists is just a pleasure. And you're right. So the poverty-related neglected tropical diseases, which basically says that they're poverty-related, and they're neglected mostly because sometimes we don't really hear a lot about them. However, they go really hand in hand with the so-called emerging and re-emerging infections, which we've been already hearing about. The distinction is that for the most part, these neglected tropical diseases are certainly prevalent among the poor, but they're highly endemic in poor populations, not only living in the low middle income country settings, but even within our countries, high income country settings, where poor populations and underserved populations live. And the major distinction is that maybe they don't kill, but they're clearly disabling, and they really can even exacerbate the diseases that then are the killer diseases, right? Like these emerging viruses. And therefore, there's a huge interplay amongst them. So we, meaning our vaccine center, we're actually based in Houston, Texas. So for us, understanding the dynamics of these poverty-related diseases with the emerging diseases, on top of that, it's worsened by the climate change, because climate change, what it does, as you know, in the Gulf Coast, we have hurricanes, droughts, you name it. It's because they actually change the dynamics of the vectors that transmit many of these diseases, the mosquitoes, and diseases such as flu, dengue, West Nile, Zika, and now all these very fancy, difficult names to say of these viruses like Oropouche virus. Clearly, there's an interplay. So our goal has always looked at how can we learn how to address these tropical infectious diseases through vaccine development and vaccination approaches, but combining it with understanding this emergence and reemergence of these new viruses and pathogens. And it's funny, when it was mentioned earlier that there was no coronaviruses on the list that were the priority back in 2010-ish, 2015-ish, right after SARS, after MERS. And in fact, we adopted them as neglected infections to the point where we were very lucky that we applied to the NIH grant. This is where it becomes very valuable. The investment in R&D early, right? Not necessarily when the diseases are occurring. So there was no more SARS. It was pre-MERS, but then it helped us to transition into MERS. And the NIH, we competed for a grant where they gave us funding to try to pilot and prepare a technology that would be ready, or at least partially ready, in case a new coronavirus pandemic, epidemic would arise, not knowing if it would be a SARS family or indeed it became a MERS family. And so we actually worked on it 10 years. And that's why when, of course, the COVID-19 hit, we could leverage 10 years of learnings where we already understood these coronaviruses, how to really rapidly design these suitable potential technologies and platforms to try to develop, of course, this, now COVID-19 specific technology. And I have to say that in our case, looking at the premise that we heard that there was a lot of challenges in ramping up, scaling up the development of these new technologies like RNA, that there was clearly some inequity even in the know-how of how to not only do the science, but also eventually access the vaccines. We opted to select a conventional platform. It's a recombinant based protein platform. It uses microbial fermentation. We actually even use yeast. It's very similar, more or less, to even how we brew beer, right? It's a fermentation technology, except, of course, scientifically adapted to produce these recombinant proteins. Our technology had basically met 5 big principles. It was a technology that could be produced in very large scales, very easy to learn, adaptable. We knew that this platform was already very established in many vaccine manufacturers, including the manufacturers in the middle income countries like India, like Brazil, like Southeast Asia. They had an existing workforce, an infrastructure, a supply chain ecosystem. We knew that these recombinant technologies tend to also have pretty decent shelf life and cold chain requirements that could enable better storage and distribution. Similar to the hepatitis B vaccine, which uses these type of technologies, very affordable due to the economies of scale. And of course, long track record of safety and efficacy, which also enable not only the regulatory processes, but also arguably could increase consumer confidence. So the outcome, we actually ended up developing 2 COVID vaccine technologies, like you mentioned, open access. We actually limited the intellectual property barriers. We published absolutely everything. And we actually created multiple partnerships, but the 2 partnerships that were the most successful, where we ended up even delivering 100 million doses, was a partnership with a India-based manufacturer called Biological E. They ended up delivering to the Indian government almost 80 million doses that were used in kids between 12 and 14 years of age, and even in adults for their booster doses. Interestingly, we also transferred our technology to Indonesia with the company BioPharma. And with them, we actually co-developed it as a halal vaccine. I can certainly answer any questions of what that really means, but it's because the yeast technology also doesn't contain any animal derived products, and certainly something that we work with them to meet their requirements. But I think most importantly, we set a precedent, right? We broke the paradigm that enabled these developing country, middle income country vaccine manufacturers to develop their own indigenous vaccines without relying on the involvement of big multinational companies, which gave them self-sufficiency. How did we do this? We, of course, sent them our know-how with all our reports and thousands of Zoom meetings. And we even sent them what I call them a little starter kit with all the reagents to start creating this vaccine manufacturing process. That's what we consider that they became first-rate innovators, meaning they designed it on their own. They scaled it, they created the products that actually met the needs of their population, meeting their own country regulatory requirements. They ensured their reproducibility, their quality, their safety, their efficacy, which is very different than what usually happens when they become contract manufacturers, meaning they're follow-on producers. Like, for example, a big multinational company already comes to them and say, this is how we want you to make our product. And therefore, they're not really innovating, and it's not really indigenous, and it doesn't become theirs, right? So for us, therefore, our success really was based on 4 main things, right? We were building and strengthening the skills and the capacity for learning how to bring these vaccine technologies And as they learn from us, we learn from them. So it was very equitable relationship and partnership. We clearly know that it happened because we had strong know-how that came from prior sustained investment by, in our case, the National Institute of Health, and funding sources that maintained our COVID program and coronavirus program even before these become disasters. And ultimately, we were also training the next generation of vaccine scientists. And ultimately, it was really a premise of solidarity, diplomacy, where we really make sure that the partnership were transparent and that it was driven really by doing good for the populations that we knew these vaccines would go and benefit, right? So
So it
I
sounds
think
like
that
the
hopefully that
benefits,
story.
yeah, so it sounds like huge benefits for the countries, but also which returns huge benefits to the US because we're when there's less virus out there, there's less virus back here. As one of the congressional representatives in Texas said about Ebola, we'd rather fight it over there than over here. And so these kinds of things of capacitating local organizations and expanding the vaccine capacity issue that both Mike and Joe talked about is really critical. So,
Absolutely.
well, thank you, Maria Elena. And so, Heather, you've worked on accelerating equitable access to proven innovations in a lot of places, and recently led the multi-million-dollar research effort with the Social Sciences Research Council. So, what have you learned about how mothers, families, and social networks make decisions about vaccines? What questions do they have, and what are some concrete examples of behavioral changes that really are good strategies for vaccine acceptance?
Excellent. Well, let me get into it. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So this is the sort of opening premise, right? Oops, there we go. A vaccine can only save a life or protect well-being if someone uses it. So we need to get from vaccines to vaccinations. And that's the social bit. That's why you get a social scientist today, in addition to all these really great bench people. And so I'm going to try to make 3 main points during our time together. So first, social processes all matter for forming a positive vaccine intention and then actually following through on it. And you might sort of initially bristle at that, but think about if you went beyond facts a little bit when you were getting a house or a car or picking your career or relationship, right? You might have looked a little bit beyond sort of the average, happiness with a certain car or something, right? So vibes matter, social matters. The message, the messenger, and the media all matter. They matter differently for different people. We'll get into that a little bit, but it's the subject of research, right? Those are empirical questions. And so we must help others make the case that vaccines are worth it for them to do for their children, for their families, for themselves, for their grandparents, or for their parents, right? And not just keep reiterating that it's safe and effective. So vaccination isn't just about the bench science. It's about trust. It's about community behavior and norms. It's about information and persuasive communication. So we need to make or support others in making these cases. And so to do that, we need to invest in investigating, implementing, and iterating communication and decision support strategies that work for different communities, online and offline, at different points in time. And so that's exactly the research that the NIH canceled yesterday. So vaccines are deeply social, right? People don't make vaccination decisions in isolation, and they don't only make them in the clinic. And there's several implications to that statement. So the one is, how can we use pro-social messaging, right? Meaning that is about sort of what we do for our community or our family, our social circle. And the evidence there is quite mixed when you try to leverage sort of someone's duty or their obligation or their responsibility to others. So during that kind of the pandemic, you might remember, especially when vaccines were first being rolled out, there's a lot of sort of do it for grandma rhetoric. And you ultimately see mixed impact on impact of that. And even beyond COVID, sort of the moral or the community or the pro-social appeal, such as to students and dorms, have a mixed impact on actual vaccine uptake. And the wording matters a lot, right? If you refer to someone's community or their circle, these little things matter, and they're all subject of intense research. There's suggestive evidence that when there's an identifiable possible victim, right, your grandma or an immunocompromised child who's in your social circle, that can positively change vaccine intentions. So sort of one thing is, how do we use our socialness to encourage people to get vaccinated? Secondly, our social circles more directly influence our vaccine decisions, right? Both vaccination and non-vaccination clusters socially. When more of our friends are vaccinated, we're more likely to be vaccinated, and vice versa. And then in addition to that social clustering, vaccination and non-vaccination also clusters geographically. The point of this map isn't to get into any specific details. These are 2019 numbers about the measles vaccine. But the real point is, despite the nationalization of news, the influence and relevance of online communicators and communities, including parenting blogs and wellness influencers that are increasingly sort of gateways into the medical freedom movement, what we see here is a lot of heterogeneity, right? We see it across states. We see it at the county level within states in sort of completion or non-completion of different vaccine doses. And so this, of course, to some extent reflects state and local policies. We're going to talk a little bit later about calls to action. What's happening in your state legislature matters a lot, including how easy it is to opt out of vaccines. Of course, some people move to be near like-minded individuals. And then there is also just simply social influence from those physically around you, right? We're all online, but apparently we're not quite online all the time. And so one thing we need to be doing is engaging in locally relevant and trustworthy messengers to help them support vaccination in ways that reflect community connections and social influence. And this is something that we're really working on, as Jono gave the kind introduction, at the Health Trust Initiative at Duke, really connecting trustworthy messengers to each other, to resources, and to evidence. All right, so the second thing I said was that messages, messengers, and media all matter. And they matter for different parts of the vaccine decision-making process. Some people help make you aware of an issue that could be different than those that provide the information, could be different from those that help you make the decision, those that help remind you to actually follow through on decisions, right? Those might be different messengers, different messages in different media, right? You could imagine a reminder on your text message, on your SMS or your WhatsApp, and maybe you wouldn't want to receive like a ream of information that way. So it all matters. So to talk a little bit about the social science. So national polling says that people, still generally trust their doctors and nurses. Those numbers are slipping a little, but they're still pretty high. But what does that actually mean? So some social scientists did this pretty cool experiment. They got some actors, they made some videos, and what they did was they had the same actor in different videos deliver the same message. In some cases, he was white lab coat guy. In some cases, he's white t-shirt guy. And here's what's kind of wild. People consistently say that there's some sort of somebody sharing the link. The study's really interesting about racial concordance and other things. But the main result is this. People overwhelmingly say that they trust and find competent white lab coat guy. And then by 15 percentage points, people that get white t-shirt guy actually get their flu vaccine. It's a specific population. This is men of color who express vaccine hesitancy. So again, you always need to do the trial in different ways, but hopefully that kind of opens up this idea that we need to be thinking about clinical or medical and non-medical, but trustworthy messengers. And so, excuse me, we really need to equip these folks to support different phases of vaccine decision-making and to do so using evidence. And so finally, we need to either make or help others make this case that vaccines are worth it. We can't just keep repeating that they're safe and effective. That isn't going to kind of close this last mile, right? So what are a few things we know? We know that there's evidence that when people can concretely state benefits from vaccines, they're more likely to be vaccinated. And so we need to make these clearer and in terms that matter to different kinds of people. For some people, sort of the death threat is the thing. For others, it's not missing days of school or work. You could imagine avoiding doctor trips and bills. You could imagine being healthy to care for loved ones. There's a lot of different values and attributes you can lead into for what benefits matter to people. We, of course, need to continue to work to make the downsides of non-vaccination more clear, including both health and non-health outcomes. We need to make clear what alternatives to vaccination, we've seen lots of vitamin A this week, actually can and cannot do to protect against disease. We need to answer safety questions in the terms that matter to people and to meet them where they're at. If they want to talk about fertility, they want to talk about specific ingredients, we need to sort of be ready to do it. And there's debunking, there's pre-bunking, there's some text you can get into. A lot of it's going to be about conversations, and we're going to talk a little bit about that into the call to action. But we really need to empower people to make their own, but hopefully positive choices based on both benefit and cost information that they weigh for themselves to get vaccinated. So finally, vaccine decisions aren't just personal, they're social. That's why you get a social scientist. And we need to investigate, communicate, and iterate accordingly. And of course, we need resources to do this. So no thanks to the NIH.
Thank you, Heather. And that takes us on to the calls for action. Thank you to all four of you for the comments that we've had so far. So in line with the founding spirit of Class Act, which is that it's not too late to change the world, this is not just about sharing information, but identifying some ways in which each of us might use our talents and opportunities for the health and well-being of our families and wider communities. So with this in mind, the panelists and Class Act have put together 3 calls to action. Number 1, promote vaccine understanding, confidence, and acceptance. Number 2, support and strengthen organizations that are vital for protecting U.S. And global health. Number 3, advocate for continued investment in scientific research and development of even more effective vaccines. So turning to the first call to action, promoting vaccine understanding, confidence, and acceptance, it takes, as we've heard from Heather, what that takes. So Heather, let me first turn back to you and then hand over to Mike on more on the how folks here, folks engaged in Class Act and who are on tonight, can help in their own settings. What actions would be helpful on this goal of promoting vaccine understanding, confidence, and acceptance? So
Yeah.
Heather?
Oh yeah, okay, great. So I'm just going to focus on a couple different kinds of conversations, and I think these links will be coming at you, and I'll try to throw a few into. So there's ongoing research on effective conversations. So if you yourself want to have kind of conversations online or offline with family and other folks, there are bridging organizations like Braver Angels. They also have a really nice social study science experiment done with them, but there are sort of ways of learning to communicate that isn't just immediately combative or sort of spitting facts and other things that, if you yourself find yourself on the front lines, you could be ready to do that. Then again, there's lots of different kinds of communicators there, that we may consider to be trustworthy messengers also on health topics. And there's different ways to try to support them in doing their work better. So I mentioned the work we're doing here at Duke about trust in health, to both connect messengers with each other as well as with other resources. I'm on the advisory board for a group called ARCLET that's specifically trying to help communicators in state and local health departments communicate better. We can advocate in various ways for better conversations between providers and patients. There's also some nice experimental social science happening about this. There's an approach called AIMS that's now been tested in a few places. We've deployed it a little bit and doing some more work with it for what I'm doing with the Clarity Foundation in British Columbia. There's also some really intriguing evidence that chatting with a chatbot can help people work through some of their uncertainty. So we also have one of those up, courtesy of Dave Rand and some folks at MIT, on what we're doing with the Clarity Foundation. And please, have a go. We'd love feedback. They have a nice JAMA article that actually shows some pretty interesting sort of reduced belief in conspiracy theories after talking to a chatbot. And then finally, conversations with your legislators. So there are a lot of different ways people are going after vaccines in state legislatures, about opt-out, trying to put kind of clauses on blood and organ donation if someone's received an mRNA vaccine, kind of backdoors into this issue. You can look at websites like Legiscan and try to see what's going on. You can get on relevant committee listservs for your state legislature, but there's a lot of action at the state level, and we need to keep an eye out. And of course, we can't do this. All of these things are empirical questions, even though they feel softer, and that requires study and that requires funding.
And just before turning to Mike, just to reassure folks who aren't fast note takers or
Sorry, yeah.
trying to get stuff out of the chat, we will be organizing all of this under the 3 calls and send out to anybody who's registered for this. So, Mike, any thoughts on vaccine acceptance?
Yeah, well, let me first of all just add a sense of perspective. I think Heather's done a very nice job of laying out some of these challenges. I had an event happen yesterday, though, that was very telling. I had a national news reporter come to my office to interview me. And on one of my shelves, I had a box of Rely brand tampons. And I was very involved with the toxic shock syndrome work back in the early 1980s. And this person looked at me and said, "What are these?" And I explained to them a toxic shock syndrome, never heard of it before, didn't know it. Well, this person was a younger aged individual who had no context to what that meant or why. And I think that one of the challenges we have today is we don't yet understand, I think, the age-specific response we're seeing, particularly in young parents. You know, a number of my veterinary colleagues will tell you for the first time in their professional careers, they've actually had owners of dogs and cats turning down the opportunity to be vaccinated for rabies because they didn't want to make the decision themselves. They'll do their own homework and do the decision themselves. And so I worry that we're not addressing nearly enough the motivating social, political, and economic factors that drive someone to make these decisions, particularly as young parents. We're talking now about a generation largely between 20 and 35 years of age. That's very different than 40 to 50 or 60 to 70. You know, we all remembered. I had a classmate in my first grade school in Iowa die from measles when I was in first grade. You know, that's a very different picture today. So in some ways, I would leave this with the quote from Lewis Carroll, who once said, "If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there." And I think we need a lot more support in the research area that Heather's working on to be able to really understand why this motivation in this younger age group and how much does information systems or lack thereof contribute to that issue. And again, as you started out your presentation, Heather, with this very nice dichotomy between vaccines and vaccinations. You're right, vaccines don't save lives, vaccinations do. And I think we have that. Now, as you know, yesterday, the NIH announced all grants or contracts that deal with vaccine hesitancy will no longer be funded and all funds provided to date will be pulled back. What a time for that to happen. And so I think that it's, you know, again, another challenge we have, but one that we can't give up on.
Okay, turning to the second, thank you, Mike. Turning to the second call to action, which is strengthening and supporting and strengthening the institutions that are so essential from anywhere, institutions like the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control, FDA, scores of others, state and local health departments and all. How do we, these are the organizations that are monitoring, that are facilitating research and development, that are sharing scientific advances, that are enabling other parts of the world to develop things. So these institutions, what in the current state, how can we support and strengthen them, these institutions, which have been and remain vital for protecting U.S. health and global health? And Mary Elena, do you want to kick off? And
Sure. And
in?
in fact, I may even highlight that together, Jonah, we worked in a committee that, in fact, purposely looked at the role of why it is important to strengthen the regulatory frameworks, not only in the US, but abroad, right? Because you really need to have a very strong ecosystem, not only of surveillance networks, right? Because we need to kind of keep an eye of what is occurring, and more the countries that, of course, surround us or that even are on the other side of the world. You know, more surveillance there is, more we could eventually get ourselves prepared, and therefore it would directly impact, you know, our own, you know, global health security right here in the United States. But you need to build that infrastructure. So I'm, of course, a big proponent of strengthening regionally and even locally, not only the regulatory agencies, right? Because they, they really establish the policies and framework of how to develop, biologicals or biopharmaceuticals. But then the role that we as academics have with the notion that, we need to constantly build that next generation of scientists that can really understand the innovations, the new technologies. I mean, science advances so quickly, but usually it's delayed by many of these policies and regulatory practices. And so I think we need to do a better job, in fact, to do that connection, right? And so more you build the support within these agencies with very well-trained individuals that really understand from even the basics of the sciences, and then moving towards the policies, the implementation practices, it would really support, like we discussed earlier, regional self-sufficiency and self-reliance, right? So that then we can actually protect each other during, of course, emergency or re-emergency of situations.
Mike, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm sure I'll be voted the downer of the evening, but we got to be real right now. We're in an unprecedented time. The dismantling of USAID is nothing short of a criminal disaster almost in terms of what's happened. We are going to continue to see our ability to interface, not just with programs like PEPFAR and so forth, but what's happening across the board with vaccine preventable disease programs in so many countries of the world. So the low and middle income countries right now will not benefit from the United States as it has provided for in the past, which is a huge issue. But let's take a step closer to home. Right now, most of the state and local public health agencies in this country have grown highly dependent on federal money for their support. A few states have invested some, but let me just give you an example. One of the crown jewel health departments in the entire United States is the Minnesota Department of Health. They have been built into one of the most notable and respectable organizations in terms of all aspects of infectious disease response and control. Right now, 95% of the Minnesota Department of Health's budget is federal support for infectious diseases, 95%. We have a state that is already now addressing serious loss of resources and budget deficits that are confronting us. And the Minnesota Department of Health is about to see much of that federal support they've gotten taken away, cut. We are so concerned about the dismantling of an organization like the Minnesota Department of Health. Well, that's going to play out throughout the country. Just know that, because one of the major resource supports is being slotted at CDC to be ended. And so it's very hard to conduct and carry out these public health programs and these responses to outbreaks when the infrastructure is suddenly gone. And so I don't think most people are aware of that, is that when I say that 95% of all support for infectious disease work in Minnesota is in fact federal support, people go, oh, that really? I think that's really the challenge we have today, is that the international and the domestic sources of professional support for vaccine work, meaning the actual selling of the vaccines to the public and the ability to respond to outbreaks, is really in critical life support condition.
And Mike, do you have a sense that I mean, is getting the members of Congress informed on these kinds of issues and others, working from the local level up, or what?
Well, as I've said earlier, I've been in this business 50 years now, and I've never seen it like this before, and I don't have an answer for you. I've served as an advisor to a number of people on the Hill, even in the past 6 months, and it seems as if this message just gets drowned out by other issues of political charge. And it just, it's not happening. So I think the challenge we have right now is these are the cards that we've been dealt. We have to deal with them. We can't turn around and walk away and say we're not going to play anymore. But I think we have to understand the challenges we have are going to require a whole new playbook. They're going to require a whole new dedication. I think this is one of the areas of the philanthropic world can play a huge role. Help bridge public health right now through this period, okay? Knowing that we're not asking foundations to support everyday programs for an indeterminate period of time. But in this period where we may lose the capability at international and national levels, now is the time we need their help.
Okay, well, with that, I think we've actually blended in the third call to action, which is investment and research. So lots of questions up here, and we got about 15, not even 15, we got a little bit of time. So where do we start? Okay, what you've talked a little. What are the political groups and corporate shareholders? What do they have? What do they stand to benefit the most from a poor state of pandemic preparedness? And the implicit there is that political groups and corporate stakeholders actually want us to be poorly prepared. And honestly, it always surprised me. They have the most to lose. The pandemic shuts businesses. The number one I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to answer the question, but the number one job of a CEO to keep the business in business. But any thoughts on how to align the incentives outside of the government, political groups, corporate shareholders? How do we align the incentives for preparedness to be in everyone's interest? Anyway, any thoughts on that, Marlena or Mike?
Well, I'll just start off with the group. I think we have to help people understand that funding public health is very similar to funding some other things that we often don't connect together. For example, one of the very well-funded fire departments in the entire state of Minnesota is the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport Fire Department. It's a remarkable asset in terms of professional experience, equipment, etc. We have not had one major plane crash in that airport since its inception. The two big planes that went down in the 1950s in South Minneapolis, handled by the Minneapolis Fire Department. Well, I'll tell you right now, we wouldn't run that airport for 30 seconds without that investment, because we recognize if something did happen, it would be so catastrophic or potentially catastrophic that we would never have enough to pay. And we saw that just a few weeks ago in Toronto. If, as much as the plane didn't crash in terms of a lot of damage to the fuselage, the fire started, and had that fire truck not been there, within a minute and a half, a lot of those people would have burnt to death. And I think that was a classic example for whatever they invested in that fire department there. We have to get people to understand investing in public health is putting out fires every day, but when the really big one happens, it also is the capacity to respond to that. And I think that's a huge issue. The second thing is public health can no longer be supported on a biannual basis. When the U.S. military decides to build a new aircraft carrier, they have a 15-year plan from the first blueprints and the first funding until the completion of that aircraft carrier. And they know it's going to be funded for 15 years, and they plan accordingly. They don't get to year 7 and say, never mind, forget it. And we need to get public health on the same footing to say it's a multi-year investment, because we don't know, what's going to happen. But more importantly, that's what's going to keep the infrastructure in place. And so I think part of it is our own challenge to creatively think about who we are, what we are, how do we sell our message. And hopefully, the pandemic, as much as no one wants to talk about it again, will serve as an example of look what happened, just as you were saying, Jono, and there's an old oil frame commercial for those few people as old as I am that remember the old line used to be, you can pay me now or you'll pay me later. Yep. And I can tell you right now, paying now is a hell of a lot cheaper than paying later.
Yeah, 13 trillion was a big, 16 trillion was a big hit. So what do the panelists say about adverse effects? One of the folks got Guillaume Barre, which is a rare complication of paralysis that starts in the feet and comes up, and if it gets to your diaphragm, it's not good. And it usually often resolves, but turns out several vaccines do have that rare side effect. Oh, and the question is, why not put these shots into the Reagan era National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program? For any observations on that? I mean, this is a program that's meant to compensate for unintended injuries, right?
Yeah, the vaccines are part of it. I don't know, I'm not sure I understand the question because they are part of the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program.
So, okay, I think that's we'll try to get back to you on that. One of the objections to vaccines is the pain of needles. When they made polio vaccines and sugar cubes, more people got that. Joe, any thoughts on different delivery mechanisms and ways of making vaccines a little bit less traumatic? I mean, we've got nasal drops, we've got patches, but what's feasible?
Yeah. Well, you know, the bottom line on vaccines, particularly against viruses, is that the best way to deliver them from the point of view of stimulating your immune system is to give somebody a shot into the muscle of the deltoid, an intramuscular injection. And that's just the way it goes across the board for vaccines. There are a few where, okay, under the skin or between the layers of the skin might do, but IM injection in the arm is the best way to go. Now, from the point of view of reducing what we call the reactogenicity aspect of that, that's not just the needle stick, but what comes after, the swelling in the arm or the induration or the fever or the chills. One of the ways to alleviate that is to make the dose that you give as small as possible, both from the volumetric perspective and also from the point of view of the irritating agent that you're putting into the person. So, again, second generation mRNA vaccines, because they're self-amplifying, they don't really get to work until they're inside of the target cells, can be delivered in very small doses. Because there is a dose dependence to the reactogenicity, the expectation is that delivering 1/5 or 1/6 the dose that they were given of the prior generation vaccine will reduce those off-target effects. And I think the evidence for that is pretty good. It's not going to make people fear needles any less, but needles in the pharma business these days are really pretty small. You think about kids who every day have to micro-inject themselves with their own insulin or their own growth hormone. You give them an injector, it's got multicolors, it looks like a fancy pen. The needle up front is very, very small. And I think the needle stick is much more tolerable than it might be otherwise on that account. So, you can cosmetically dress it up, but at the end of the day, you do have to put the needle under the skin. And the smaller the dose, the better.
Okay. I got another question on or comment on funds for global. Well, this is good funds for global work going to foundations. That clearly is one of the things that you're pointing to, Mike. What about question? Please speak to the influence of vaccine exemptions on perception and legal status and rights. What's the situation with vaccine exemptions? And what might we do about that?
So
Yeah, Heather, do you?
well, I was just saying, I don't actually know if I understand the question. For example, I don't know if anyone has looked at what happens after you change exemptions, so you allow more philosophical opt-outs or whatever on sort of a broader perception. That would be kind of an interesting natural experiment study, but I don't know if anyone has done that. I do think this is going to be an evolving question, though. I mean, I think as we sort of potentially move into what seems to be more of a medical freedom and health freedom mindset, that having people be able to make that choice and then giving them a lot of support make that choice, whereas kind of mandates and other things are currently creating quite a knee-jerk reaction. I mean, I'd like to say it's an empirical question, but I think we need to think it through clearly. We know that the goal is to get everyone who's eligible vaccinated, but how we do that might not be the same way we did it in the 50s and the 60s.
You know, if I could just add a piece here, because again, this is another critical issue that's just come up. Somebody may be aware that the CDC announced earlier in the week that they now would actually take on a major study of measles vaccine and autism, an issue that has been resolved years and years ago. And we don't need another apple to fall from a tree to prove gravity works, okay? But the bottom line is that what this is going to do is continue to stimulate those who believe that there are these yet unrecognized or unappreciated side effects that occur from vaccines. A second point that's going to happen is the secretary has already noted that he's going to put a primary emphasis on actually getting parents more informed about what happens when you get a vaccine for your child. And he's using the VAERS data. And anyone who knows about what VAERS data is, it's a man reporting voluntarily of anything that happens in your life, whether it's a heart attack, a car accident, or you win the lottery. You know, you can report that within the period of time immediately after vaccination. It is not cause and effect. But when you start listing all the potential implications of people naming, this happened, this happened, this happened. You know, remember, thousands of people die every day in this country from heart attacks. What's the chances of one of them having just been vaccinated for COVID in the 4 or 5 days before is actually very high, but it now sits on VAERS as a heart attack, and it'll be laid out that way. So I think we're in big trouble right now trying to get a more informed public because of this misinformation. And Joe, I just follow up, you know, one of the things we hear right now is that today kids will have had, on average, following the recommendations of the CDC, ACIP, 18 injections by the time they reach the age of 16. And most of those are filled in those first years. And parents see that injection. I think they hurt more than the child does when that happens, but it's a real issue. And so part of it is, wouldn't it be great if we could get the number of injections down? Because I do agree with Joe, those are really still the most important ways to administer vaccines from an immunologic standpoint. But I'm telling you, it causes a nightmare for parents.
So one final question, just following on that, what percent of people need to not get vaccinated to make epidemics possible for different diseases? So in other words, when are we threatened? When does lack of vaccination threaten expanding a local outbreak into a major epidemic or pandemic? I mean, we know the answer, Mike. I don't know what you want to say about
Well,
this.
I mean, again, I feel bad. I don't know if you dominate, but it depends greatly on the agent because it's how effective it is in transmitting. For example, I really believe the only 2 infectious agents today that we have that can cause a pandemic are influenza viruses, coronaviruses. Other, you know, and our group has very actively been working on this. We've actually done the roadmaps for Ebola, Lassa, Nipah, so forth. And while those are really important diseases of critical regional importance, which can, as we saw in Western Africa in 2014-15, look what Ebola did. You know, 20,000 cases. It was remarkable. But it wasn't not a virus with wings that could spread around the world quickly like a respiratory viral pathogen can. And so I think that that's really 2 different answers here. One is, what is it needed to control a critical regional importance disease? You've got to have vaccines, whether you pre-deploy them or not. Pandemics, I think, you know, once a pandemic starts, it's gone, it's done. All you can do is hopefully minimize the number of severe cases by having adequate vaccine, as has been pointed out.
And I mean, one of the key things, it depends on how many people an infected person spreads it to. And the issue with measles vaccine, and we're really lucky that it's 97% effective, because each kid with measles spreads to at least 18 other kids. With pandemics where it's harder to spread and all, then you can take a little bit lower level of vaccination. So yes, it is disease dependent, and it's the respiratory viruses that are pandemic related. Others that are the ones that are mosquitoes and person-to-person contact and all cause a lot of trouble regionally, but won't go global. So we're coming to the end here. We've laid out 3 calls to action: promoting vaccine understanding and confidence and acceptance, strengthening the organizations, and advocating for continued investment in research. All of those we've heard are under real threat today. And I think that the key message is don't give up. I mean, we've seen the impossible happen at least 3 times over the last many years. It took 15 years for the world to decide to set out to eradicate smallpox after Europe and North America had proven it was possible. Once folks finally and one of the reasons why they didn't go farther faster was because at that time, the head of the World Health Organization and other people thought it was impossible. They couldn't imagine eradicating smallpox without vaccinating the whole planet. Well, it turns out all you had to do is circle around where smallpox was and vaccinate. So what was thought to be impossible happened. If in the year 2000, when AIDS was a death sentence in Africa and $12,000 per person per year, lots of folks in the public health community said it's impossible. What can we do? Today, it's $120 per person per year, and we have gotten AIDS. Had gotten AIDS well on the way, and within a decade, after people said it was impossible, by the year 2010, we had 8 or 10 million people on treatment. So I'm with Mike in terms of, and others in terms of don't give up and stay with it, because we have turned things around. But what we're hearing tonight right now and are seeing daily in the news is it's a challenge. I think it's clear that vaccines are one of the greatest gifts within modern medicine. And we didn't get that gift. Sorry, just to squander it. So, Marion, with that, back to you.
Thank you, Jono. And thank you, all of you, Heather, Joe, Maria Elena, and Mike. This has been so important and gives us both hope and the desire to never give up and to do what we can. And we thank you all for your service to all of us and to the world, because you have committed your lives to this work and you have been making a difference. And we will try to do our best to continue to support the work that you all and all of your colleagues have done over the years. My thanks also go to the members of our really wonderful production team: John Noren, Sarah Ulrich, Jackie Swearingen, Rick Brotman, Diana Labanchu, Katie Marinello, and Kate Freed. And finally, I thank all of you who have joined us this evening. This is the 31st forum that Class Act has done since we began with Jono 5 years ago. And later this spring, we will be presenting a forum in collaboration with our bridge partner, Justice Aid, titled "Reproductive Rights: Is Being Pregnant a Crime?" We endeavor to sustain and improve our program, so please fill out the quick survey that you'll get in your email this evening. And please visit our website and view the videos and resources from previous forums as well. As we said at the beginning, and you saw from the chat, there are an incredible number of resources. We will put them together in a way that makes sense by topic and share them along with the videos, both a short one and a condensed one and a full video of this forum within a week, and it will be on our website. But all of you will receive, anyone who registered will receive notice via email that those are up. We now invite you to join us for a post-forum salon for open conversation. This was posted, the link for this was posted in the chat, and you received it in the email for this event. So thank you again to all of our panelists and to John O'Quick, and thank you all for being with us this evening. Good night.